What I want to mention right away is that this is just an introductory, like dip your toes in kind of thing, a little glimpse at cultures and how they affect communication and conflict styles, but hopefully it's a base upon which you can build into the future. And just a little heads up, at a couple different points in today's little learning opportunity, you'll be asked to write a few things down. Really, literally 8 characters or numbers. Not a lot, so you don't have to stress, but there is just some scrap paper around on the things, and I tried to not put any in the first row, but yeah, then there was this second row phenomenon. So I'm just gonna hand these out. This is just scratch paper. It's old stationery that we don't use anymore. So, but y'all can use any scrap paper. So just take a piece and pass it around if you don't have scrap paper with you today. All right, so if we're talking about communication tendencies, and how that relates to culture or subcultures, it's important to think just a wee little bit about culture. Edward Hall, who's a big dude in culture and culture studies, defined culture as the systems of knowledge shared by a relatively large group of people. And these systems include things like our notion of time or our expectations related to who has power in my groups, right? And analyzing things like the products, the practices, and the perspectives in the culture and how they relate to each other. Our cultures, and I say cultures because some of us might have a foot or something in more than one culture, and certainly different subcultures. Our cultures really determine our lens through which we view the world and navigate our life in it, right? So there's also a whole bunch of different things we could focus on, but we're not going to necessarily. All of these. We are going to look a little bit at some national or broad international kinds of ethnic cultures. But there's also regional cultures, so people will talk about West Michigan nice, right? Or a New York kind of vibe. So there's regional cultures. There are gender cultures that is completely societally determined, and it's not the same in every society or every subculture in a society. There's generational cultures, so it's highly likely, though not absolutely certain, that a child is going to see things quite differently from a grandparent, a great-grandparent, just because not only life experience, but the culture, the time in which they were raised or grew up. There's also different social classes with different subcultures and ways of dealing with the world. And there's organizational cultures too, like Calvin has kind of its own culture, right? And it can be intimidating when you first get into it. It can also feel like home after a short period of time, or maybe never, it kind of depends. But we're not going to focus on all of those. We're going to look a little bit at national, broad, international kinds of cultures, and then we're going to look a little bit at some of the broad subcultures in the United States and how those different groups tend to approach communication and conflict. All right, so in just a minute, so this is where you need to have your piece of scrap paper, so grab one off the seat or get one from a neighbor, and then you need something to write with. So fiddle around with that and get something to write with, because I didn't bring pencils for everybody. Beg, borrow, or steal. Don't steal, just beg or borrow. And we're going to look at 4 different factors. And you're going to rate yourself where you think your preferences are in terms of, and don't worry if these are new to you, because we'll explain them as we go on. High and low context, if that's a new concept, don't worry, all right? It's kind of how much you like things spelled out versus how much you can just kind of assume based on stuff you know. B is, are you more direct or indirect in how you like to communicate? C is, are you more instrumental or expressive? Okay, communication is to make a point, or it's to express something perhaps more emotional. And D, are you more formal or informal in how you prefer to communicate and negotiate conflict? All right, so here is the first one. So you can write down A, if that's all you want to write down, or you can do low context, high context, but write A. And you are going to give yourself a number on this scale, 7 to 1, somewhere in here. At the 7 end, I believe people should be clear in exchanging facts and information. Or, on this end, I believe people shouldn't have to discuss everything explicitly. A lot of information is understood from the context. right? Don't overthink it. Just write down A on your piece of scratch paper and give yourself a number. What is your preference? Do you like things spelled out, real explicit and quote unquote clear? Or are you kind of okay just not having everything spelled out in detail? That's so tedious, right? And you just you know what you have to do and you do it. So give yourself a number between 1 and 7. All right, second one, B. Do you prefer more direct types of communication and conflict negotiation or more indirect? So at the direct end, I prefer explicit one- or two-way communication, including identification, diagnosis, and management of the conflict. Or at this end, I prefer implicit intuitive communication, and I avoid conflict. Or some of you are going, yes, I avoid conflict or direct confrontation when possible. All right, give yourself a number between 7 and 1. C, third one, more instrumental or more expressive. So at that end, I value unemotional, impersonal communication styles. Objectivity is good. And at this end, the expressive end, I value emotional, personal communication styles. Subjectivity makes the message real. All right, give yourself a number between 1 and 7. Last one, formal or more informal. At the formal end, it is important to follow protocol and social customs. Showing respect in how we speak is valued. And at the more informal end, one can easily dispense with ceremony and rigid protocol. A casual style seems personal. All right, so give your number. That's the fourth one. Now, what we want to do is take a look at how different cultures around the world, what the experts say they would answer to these questions. Little caveat here. A lot of this work is based on the Cultural Intelligence Center and their work with different cultures around the world. But we all know inside any culture, there's a lot of diversity and not everyone fits the mold, right? So these are tendencies, generalizations that can be helpful, but I do not want you leaving here and saying, well, Penny said that everyone in Ghana does it this way, so obviously everyone in Ghana does it that way. It's not that simple. All right, so here we go. For the low versus high context, so that's like the gotta spell it all out or can kind of go with the flow and understand a lot. And direct versus indirect. They tend to line up similarly, okay? And this is what the Cultural Intelligence Center says are some of the, I'm going to say broad ethnic country groups that would be at this end. So at this end, more indirect and high context are Arab, Confucian Asia, Southern Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. One thing I do appreciate about the Cultural Intelligence Center framework is they do distinguish at least 2 or 3 different kinds of Asia. Thank you. It's just like, I don't know, a third of the world, and it's not all the same. So they try to do that. I pick a little bit at how they divide things up, and a few things you'll find out later. So at this end, which prefers spelling it all out, right, and being fairly direct, they have Anglo, which would include the United States, right? Germanic Europe and Nordic Europe. And then more in the middle, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Latin Europe. So more Southern Europe, extending into maybe Croatia, Italy, Spain. Right. All right, so how did you place yourself? So for those of you who grew up and might say, I have roots in American majority culture, right? You would expect to have yourself more at this end of the scales on A and B, right? And for those of you who have a foot in majority culture America in Calvin University, but also a foot in some other subcultures, or just radically different personalities and, the people around you, you may have found yourself somewhere else on the scale. Okay, so this is just becoming a little more aware of your preferred tendencies and those of other people in the world and in your circles. If you are at the 7 end of these 2 factors, what do you find annoying or challenging? So if you really like everything spelled out, right, and you like things to be pretty direct, like go for the diagnosis and the solution and the and the next steps, right? You outline those at the end of your meeting. So if you're that kind of person, that's how you want to communicate and negotiate conflict. What are you going to find annoying or challenging? Yeah.
When people aren't direct with you or like kind of steer around the question or answer.
So at work, I'm this way. If I send someone an email with 3 questions and they only kind of answer one of the 3, it's like, I have to send 3 more emails, or put each of my questions in a different email. It's one of my little frustrations. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I traveled once and was very frustrated that people wouldn't say, I don't know. If I asked a question, nobody in that culture would say, I don't know. They would say something else. And I think I learned later, like, it's like they wanted to say, I don't know. Like it wasn't, I was like expecting directness and yeah, something else.
Yeah. So some of that can be saving face, which is like not appearing to be, for lack of this is total simplification, but like not appearing stupid, but also not appearing unhelpful or disrespectful, because that could, in a culture, be a sign that I don't want to help you. Right? So there's a lot going on there. Okay. Right. If you are one of these people, you prefer this way, like, I don't need everything spelled out, thank you. I know very well how to do that. And you prefer a little avoiding conflict, a little less direct, more indirect ways of dealing with conflict. What is going to be hard or frustrating for you?
And you think people are over communicating, they're sharing too many details and specifics that you don't think are necessary.
Yeah. I think too, for people who want to avoid conflict, and if they're in a relationship with someone who likes the directness of getting to the point, let's figure out what the problem is, and then we're going to figure out a solution, and we're going to outline next steps. If you put them in the same space, right, they're going to hate, it's going to be hard, right? And there may be some of us who are, or have been, or will be in relationships like that, whether it's a roommate or a significant other or a parent or a child. All right, so we had 2 more things that we looked at, right? The third one was instrumental versus expressive, and this is what the experts say, how the different national countries might line up. So at the more instrumental end, so objectivity, emotions can be a little bit suspect, right? Introduce like things that don't matter. You might find Confucian Asia, Eastern Europe, Germanic Europe, and Nordic Europe. So this is interesting because in other factors that we looked at, right, these are in completely different areas. But in this one, Confucian Asia is together with Germanic Europe. Right? All right, and then at this end, I value emotional personal communication styles. Subjectivity makes the message real. The experts say Arab, Latin American, Latin Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa. We might think of maybe just more expression overall, expressiveness in communication. And then in the middle, they put the USA in the middle. Like we like some of each. Like if you're too objective, some of us go, ooh, like sterile, right? And if you're too over here, they're like, all it is like Oprah crying all the time. You might say, I'm not saying that's true of everybody, but okay. So how did you place yourself on the scale? Think about that. And the thing to realize is that a lot of code switching happens. So there can be people, maybe some international students or faculty or staff that you're aware of, that their culture, that their home culture might be in a different place from United States America. But the fact that they're here and they're succeeding and they're doing their job and they're, communicating means generally that they have learned how to do that here. Same thing goes for our students. Just because your student maybe does come from part of Africa or Eastern Europe or Asia doesn't mean that they don't know the rules or haven't figured it out in an implicit way. they're here, they're doing the work. That doesn't mean we also can't help them, right? Because they could feel like, I know how to do it, but that isn't comfortable for me. Like, I prefer it this other way. And so if we're a little more aware of that, can have those conversations, we can create spaces for people to really feel like they belong, even if it's not the classroom in North Falls, right, at 8 a.m. or whatever. All right, so formal versus informal was the last one. This is what the experts say, how things line up. At the more formal end is Arab, Latin America, and Southern Asia. And at the more informal end is the United States, right? So even in some top companies, the CEO might say, oh, call me Bob. That's not going to happen in some other cultures. That would be a complete insult to the power structure, right? Germanic Europe and Nordic Europe. And these arrows indicate places where I disagree with what the experts said, right? I am a German professor, and I would say that Germans like to kind of project this, we understand Americans and their casualness vibe, but deep down inside, they're a little more formal. Like, they like all the titles. You know, when I go there, I'm like, Frau Dr. Professor so-and-so, and that's how the invitations to me come in the mail, right? They still like their kind of formalities. I also think Confucian Asia, they say it's in the middle, but I'd say it's a little more towards the formal, and they just express it differently than we do. So some people don't read it the same, but it's still considered a type of formality in how they prefer or tend to communicate and navigate conflict. All right, so you're thinking to yourself, well, where did I place myself on here? Did I line up with what the Anglo, the US American thing said? And the question is, how do you balance different communication styles in your personal life, in your family, with your in-laws, with your unusual uncle, in your church community, which may have many subcultures in it, or be homogeneous, and in your workspaces, right? How do you balance the different tendencies that you feel versus maybe what the big culture is? So these 4 things are important. Cultural expectations for communication styles vary across cultures, right? Knowing a little bit more is important to understanding what kind of sets us off and puts us on edge, or what might be a communication thing happening in your team, right? So these things happen. There's a department or a working team, and one person never seems to contribute much, right? And so the chair of the team or the department's kind of saying, hey, Sam, what do you think? And Sam's just sort of like, yeah, it's okay, right? But Sam never seems to contribute much. Now, that could be a personality thing, and it could be that Sam actually doesn't have anything to contribute, but then why would we be hiring Sam? But it could be also communication and conflict styles. Like, there's a lot going on there. And if we know a little bit more, if we're in a relationship somehow with Sam, we know where they come from or what their history is, we might be in a position to say, hey, is there something else going on here? Is there a way that we can modify how we run the meeting so that Sam can feel comfortable making contributions in a way that don't transgress or like go against some of the things that maybe avoidance of conflict or more formality, like they don't want to challenge the chairperson, right, in a public setting because that feels so disrespectful. Like, there could be a lot of stuff going on there that we just need to be aware of. That doesn't mean it's going on in every situation. It could just be Sam had a really bad day, right? But we need to be aware that those things can be happening and just kind of be tuning and be aware, just ask some questions. So if we as a community have some vocabulary to talk about that, we might be able to put it out there, just say, hey, I'm wondering, is this me, playing a role? If it's not, that's cool. But I'm just wondering, like, is this part of the picture here? Can we help you somehow? So that's all good things. Cross-cultural strategic, that's part of cross-cultural strategic communication, right? That's one of the things that this is just like a little appetizer bite to get you on that journey, be thinking about that and how to do that well. The third thing here, head versus heart. When someone's communication style is different from our own or different from like the Calvin academic culture, we can feel put off or confused or sometimes even offended. However, if we know a little bit more about the cultural differences, then our head knowledge can balance out what our feelings might be in a situation. Okay? This also happens with directness versus indirectness, especially if it's something negative sometimes, right? That can feel almost like an attack if someone's very direct with a negative piece of feedback. And you just need to, if that's something that triggers me, because I prefer to avoid the whole conflict, I just need to be aware of that going in. And the final thing here, adapting and belonging. I mentioned this earlier, but knowing a bit about the cultural differences in communication styles can help us be more hospitable and welcoming as a culture in this organization, in our church, right? In your family, when your nephew brings a significant other home for the first time. So there's lots of instances where there's a little bit of sensitivity. You don't want to make a lot of assumptions and go in there like, well, your new friend is from so-and-so, so we all have to talk this way. No. Right? But just a little tuning and awareness can just create a sense of belonging in a way that complete ignorance and just totally assuming they're just like you is not going to do the trick. All right. So that's the first half. Second half of the show. In the first half, we just introduced like some broad national cultures. In the second half, we want to take a look at some subcultures in the United States, because that's maybe, although we do have a lot of international students and an ever-increasing number of international faculty and staff, we also have a lot of BIPOC or POC or white Hispanic workers, employees of different sorts, and students at our campus. So what might be helpful to know about their tendencies, again, not homogeneous, there's lots of diversity, but tendencies in communication and conflict styles to help us think about how to make the place welcoming and how to maybe just be a little more aware and tuned in if something might be going on. All right, so there are two characteristics of communication styles that are really important, especially to understanding conflict, and there's these two. Directness and indirectness, which we already touched on, and then emotional restraint and emotional expressiveness, which is a little bit related to one of the things we looked at, but it's also a little different. This work and framework is based primarily on work by the Intercultural Development Inventory, also called the IDI. They've done a lot of work in cross-cultural communication as well. So this grid, we're going to take a closer look at it. There's a 2x2 grid, if you think about it. And if you would think of each of the four quadrants then, this is the words that they attach, the IDI attaches to these quadrants. In the upper left, so very direct and emotionally restrained, all right? Those people like discussion. Let's talk this out, right? In the lower left, let's do this one. In the upper right, so you are direct, but you like or appreciate or tend towards emotional expressiveness. Those people would be engaged, right? Again, these are just cover terms, but just to get you can imagine, maybe you're thinking, oh, that's Joe, oh, that's Jane, oh, that's Peter. Okay. So lower left, indirect folks, right? And the emotionally restrained. So if you're indirect and emotional restrained, you tend towards accommodation. Right? Let's just keep it cool. Let's maybe avoid conflict unnecessarily. And then at the indirect and emotional expressiveness, you might be quite dynamic. All right, so what this looks like. I had this college roommate, all right? And she was lovely, and I do love her, and I hope that none of you know who she is. But, you know, college freshman, you're getting used to living with another person. And she would walk in the door and walk out of her shoes. And then the next day she would do the same thing with a pair of shoes. And there was just like a lot of stuff, right, hanging out between the doorway and the bathroom, which is a relatively short amount of space, goes right past your closets, and it's the walkway, as you know from the dorms, right? And I would say something like, hey, could you pick up your shoes? Direct, emotionally restrained, because that's me, right? And my roommate would sometimes do it, but then it would happen again, and sometimes wouldn't do it. And then one day, she blows up at me, in my opinion, by my lens, and gets really mad about the fact that it's not a big deal. Right? Definitely more emotionally expressive, and somewhere in between direct and indirect. Like she was pushed towards directness because I kept bugging her. All right. So I want to be mad because she totally ignored my request, right? My attempts at negotiating this little conflict. But what I realized later, really, is that from her perspective, it wasn't that important because I wasn't being emotionally expressive. I never, like totally blew up about it, quote unquote, but that's not it. I just never showed her that it was really important to me by my expression, right? So you can imagine how if you're in different quadrants from your roommate or your spouse or your best friend or your child or your parent, you can actually do this with each other and just not be communicating what you intend to communicate. Okay. Let's see, how much time do we have? Okay, so if this is your conflict preference, right? This is actually where I would say our academic space is, right? We tend to be more direct and emotionally restrained. This is also stereotypically for the United States white male spaces. So there's an overlap between white male spaces and academic spaces. This is to some extent where majority culture America is, but not completely. And let's add some layers here. I would say it's Kelvin and general spaces, right? And maybe that upper left corner stereotypically is more North Pole. and maybe one extends to Spoolhof, and maybe some of Hininga, and our art center is maybe the red circle. But I want you to think about what is the default or expected conflict style in your specific area, in your specific office or working teams. And it might be different in different working teams, right? So another story, I spend a lot of time in meetings. There's usually a fairly good mix of men and women. Until recently, one of the big teams I was like the only person of color, so it was a completely white space. But once I had a meeting with 2 African American women, and we had things we had to discuss and plan. It was an event coming up, and I walked in the room, and there was just talking about so many fun things, kids, and to be honest, a little stereotypical, but it happened, and purses and events coming up and social things, and the end of an hour, we had totally planned the event, but it was a completely different social communication context, right? Than, let's say, the big meeting with all the white faces and males. But I wouldn't say that we didn't get our work done or that it was inefficient. It was just different. But if that's how you like to be, if that's what makes you feel belonging and connection with people, and you only get to be in this other kind of meeting all the time, because that's the dominant space, right? It's not like you can't do it, but it's going to contribute to how you feel at home, or being able to, figuratively let your hair down a little and connect in ways with other colleagues and people, right? So there are folks for whom they're constantly operating at work, at least, in a kind of communication space, which they're perfectly able to do, but they just might be feeling like they're missing that opportunity to connect at a real personal level, because that is just not happening for them the way they like it in that space, right? And that sense of belonging and that sense of being able to contribute freely without constantly filtering what you're saying so that it appeals and comes across directly enough, but not too indirectly, and formally enough, but not too. And so, right, if you're constantly doing that kind of thing, you can imagine if that's how you operate 8 hours a day at work, it's going to make a difference in how you feel about this space. All right. So we're going to do another little bit of thinking about the subcultures in the United States. So again, this is based on work by other experts, not me. But the red here would be sort of academic white majority culture spaces. And I've put the red circles around where experts say, and where I kind of think, yeah, this is where those people would say I prefer to be. So at the top, you have, right, the high and low context, then the direct versus indirect, Then the more objective versus subjective kinds of things, emotional restraint maybe versus expressiveness, and then formal versus informal, right? So this is what I and other experts would say. This is white majority America. This is maybe Calvin Academic University, right? We like to spell things out. We like to have things fairly direct. We think objectivity is good, and crying is not going to improve the lecture. And we're kind of in the middle. Some professors will say, call me Bob. Some won't, but it's not like you have to say, oh, Professor Dr. So-and-so, can I please see you at 2 a.m. or not 2 a.m. 2 p.m. All right. So this is what this is majority culture America. But what about some other cultures we have? Green. So certain Asian cultures, again, Asia's huge, all right, but we're just doing broad, and this is more Asian/Asian American cultures. This is where the experts say that people with strong cultural roots, upbringing roots in those cultures would prefer to be on these same factors or scales, right? So when it comes to spelling things out, or understanding what you have to do based on the context, they're way at the opposite end of Calvin University, right? When it comes to direct or indirect, they're also kind of at the opposite end. Avoid conflict, right? Because that's, if I openly have a conflict with you, that's showing disrespect. Right? That doesn't mean we don't have ways to negotiate our differences, right? It's just that it's a different way from maybe the way a majority culture person would prefer to do it and would think is right. Okay. When it comes to this one, instrumental versus expressive, they're more similar. And same here, they're a little more similar, but the Asian or Asian American person might tend to be a little more formal. So they might be less comfortable calling their professor Jane, right? And just tend to say Professor so-and-so instead because they just can't quite do it. While as maybe the majority culture American kid is like, oh, that's cool. Jane, right? Because it has some sort of positive thing for them. And it's not transgressing, it's not making them feel like, it's so disrespectful. So another story. When I was in Cambodia leading groups of students, we had 3 professors from Calvin and like 30 students. And all the professors agreed it's okay, we're like sleeping on mattresses in church basements and really getting to know each other better than we want to because everyone's going to have tummy issues and then I have to deal with them. So we're all getting to know each other pretty well. We all said, oh, you can call me Penny. You can call me, Len or David or whatever. In Cambodia, they're much more formal, okay, in those kind of contexts, especially in a teacher-student or heaven forbid, like a professor-student relationship. So we're being hosted by a group in a city, and I told, there was like a TA person there, a younger person, he was maybe 24, he had graduated college, so he was no longer a peer, if you will, but he wasn't that much older. And he was helping us, like running things, translating, doing all this kind of stuff. And I said, hey, call me Penny. And I just noticed that he wasn't doing that. He was like going to great lengths to avoid even using any kind of name with me, right? And finally I was like, yeah, that's hard. And so this is the compromise. So finally he said, can I call you Aunt Penny? In Cambodia, there is a word that is the equivalent of auntie that you put in front of an older female or someone that you want to show respect for, even if it's not a blood relative, right? And it's just a way of saying, maybe you might in the South, you might say Miss Pearl, right? As just this extra little layer of I defer to you, I'm showing you respect. So can I call you Aunt Penny? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And then we turned around and we said, hey guys, to our students, this is a situation, we should have been more aware of this. We will be more aware next time. But it's so uncomfortable for some of our Cambodian hosts to hear you referring to us by our first names because it feels so disrespectful, right? You may know up here, Americans are casual and informal and they call their CEO Bob. But it's still, when you hear it and you see it going on, it just feels like, okay, I know, but I can't do it. And if they're doing it and I'm not doing it, then, so from that day on, it was like all the students called us auntie and uncle. right? That was our compromise. But we need to be aware of those things. It's not just what you know up here, it's how it makes you feel here. Whether we're the hosts or the guests in a situation, we can be more aware of communication and conflict styles, right? Preferences, and then find good sort of middle pathways forward. All right, yellow. I'm hoping that some people in this room can actually help me with this, so tell us if the experts are wrong. So this yellow is supposed to represent more Latinx cultures in the United States, right? So on the top, between I like everything spelled out and I like things more understood from context, experts say Latinx cultures in the United States are more in the middle. They're not at that either end. When it comes to being direct again or indirect, they're again more in the middle. But when it comes to being more unemotional and objective versus more expressive, so more expressively restrained versus expressive, they will tend towards more expressiveness. Okay? And then there's a lot of overlap here in the formal versus informal. Is anyone here who could speak to their own preferences in that? Don't want to make any assumptions, but I'm going to obviously have to talk to my Spanish colleagues to see what they have to say. All right. And the blue one, this is again our tendencies. They are not absolutes. Does anyone have an idea what the blue one might represent? Subculture in the United States. BIPOC subculture. This is supposed to be representative of a tendency in African American cultures. All right. So on the like everything spelled out versus not, they're slightly towards spelling things out, but not completely as much as American majority academic culture. For direct versus indirect, they're a little more direct, certainly more direct than the Asians, right? Maybe not quite as direct as the white males. When it comes to being sort of more objective or emotionally restrained versus emotionally expressive, the black circle, the African Americans, might tend towards, along with the Latinx folks, a little more towards the expressiveness, quite in contrast to both the Asians and the Anglos or the majority culture in America. And then they're very much in the middle when it comes to formal versus informal, meaning there are some contexts where it's important to be more formal, and there might be contexts where it's important to not be so formal. Does anyone want to add anything to that from their own experiences?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So where would biracial folks land on the scale?
See, and that's another
There's
thing.
a lot of that code switching that happens.
That can be what happens. And I'm going to say that a lot of us do this a little bit. So you might, if you're going to go visit your grandma for the afternoon, you might actually just kind of slide into a slightly different way of communicating than if you're going to hang out with your best girl/boyfriends, right? Or if you're babysitting niece and nephew or young person, we have different ways of communicating, right? But with bicultural people, it's interesting if they're biracial or bicultural. So you can have, I'm going to say, adoptees, right? Who, like, I did, never mind. There are folks who get adopted and they actually don't have a lot of cultural background to their biological home root place. And then they just grow up with the cultural understandings of whatever their family or spaces are. But then the way we look affects the way other people communicate with us, right? So if I look a certain way and I enter into a group where other people are looking that way, they might just assume and adopt me in and start acting, and then I will adjust, especially if I'm at a young age and learn to do that. I will adjust, even if that's not what my parents do at home. I will sort of learn, well, when I'm with this group of friends or people like this is the way we hang, right? But code switching is definitely part of it, and it's a skill set that some people are incredible at. And it can happen like on the turn of it can happen in the space of 3 sentences back and forth, depending on your conversation. Mm-hmm. Good question. Okay, so here's just a couple interesting things. Again, they're from the experts that say this. I just wanted to mention a few things that practices that are often active in African American communities and that could be helpful for Anglo communities, for Calvin University community to know. Don't use this to make assumptions without communicating and actually having a conversation about that, if that's helpful. But it's just something to maybe have, as part of your radar system. So here's a few things that the experts say. One of the characteristics of some African American community communication is simultaneous communication. So this is where folks talk at the same time or overlap or make confirming or disapproving remarks while someone else is talking. Okay, so maybe those of us who aren't, who haven't spent a lot of time in African American communities, but maybe we have been to a worship service that was very much rooted in African American cultures or in subcultures, right? And maybe then in that context, you've heard people doing that overlapping communication, right? It could be as simple as an amen. It could be a preacher. It could be help him, Lord, if they're having, if it's not going well, you might hear something that responds to that in a public way and overlaps with what's being said in other spaces. But this can happen at not just in a congregational setting, but in a small setting as well. So a second thing that the experts say is can be a part of the communication tendencies in African American subcultures are fluid turn taking, where folks jockey for the opportunity to voice an opinion. Turn taking is often more fluid and not necessarily dictated by an agenda or that's all planned out in advance. Okay, and the Calvin community, the academic, I've been on some hiring teams, we script everything for those interviews. It's like, you're going to ask question 1, and if there's a follow-up, then you're going to ask the follow-up, and then right? It's so scripted, and it's an attempt to be fair. We have our reasons, but in other spaces, in African American spaces, and certainly in less formal spaces, there's a lot of fluid turn-taking that can happen. So for some people, and even families, like I think my family has pretty fluid turn-taking around the dinner table, and we talk a lot about a lot of different things. And we're constantly just sort of like jumping in and saying, hey, and that, and did you hear? And when my daughter-in-law she recently confided in me, when she first joined our family, she said, that took so much getting used to. Like I had to pay attention and concentrate on the talk at dinner. And like, is now a good time for me to open my mouth and say something? Or should I not? Oh wait, if I don't say anything, is that bad? She's like, it just took so long to feel comfortable in that space. I'm like, aw, like I really love my daughter-in-law. I didn't know that at the beginning, right? And maybe I should have been a little more tuned in when I noticed that maybe she wasn't contributing, right, as much as the rest of us. We're all like, right? So it can be helpful just to have the radar, have some of these things in mind, whether it's around our own little private dining table, or in the church community, or when we're visiting, or when we have a guest pastor from a different community. That again, don't use this information to make bad assumptions and do unhelpful things, but have it as part of your radar and your lens to ask good questions about best ways forward. All right, so the third thing to mention that experts talk about, and this isn't just for African American culture, but the one I read was specifically talking about this, but I would say the same thing about certain Asian cultures, is the issue of eye contact and body language. So eye contact is, and what it means and when to do it and when not to do it, is completely culturally embedded, right? So I'm talking to you guys, and I'm purposefully not staring back at the room the whole time, or down at my notes, right? I'm trying to like touch, and like peek and make sure I'm just, like touching each of you a little bit with my eyes, right? And for the most part, you're all staring at me. I don't know if you're thinking about something else, but you're trying to be polite, right? You're staring at me, you're giving me a couple nods now and then. That's standard academic American majority culture eye contact rules. Thank you. Because if someone was like, the whole time, I would feel a little put off, right? This is not true in other subcultures or other cultures. And in certain African American cultures, eye contact is quite a different thing. And direct eye contact can be seen as quite disrespectful, especially if there's a power dynamic difference, right? And even, so I don't want to spend a lot more time there, but just to be aware of that. And the same can be true of certain Asian cultures as well. So in certain Asian cultures, if I'm with someone who has more power and societal status than I do. I'm going to say like the 70-year-old CEO of a company, and I happen to be there talking to them, I will not make a lot of eye contact. Even though we're both we've lived in America, we know the rules, I still don't do that. And the funny thing is, I was at the airport actually meeting up with the 70-year-old CEO of a company who had donated money so that my team could go to Cambodia. And we're in there, and there's also another colleague who's a little older than I am, but he's a male. And we're just having a conversation actually in like a waiting gate area. It wasn't very glamorous. So it's not a formal situation at all. We're like met up at the airport because he lived in Chicago and he drove in to say hi to us and meet the students whom he had funded to go. So it was that kind of a setup. And after he left, my colleague turned to me and he said, "You looked at the ground a lot." It's like, what's up with that? And I had to actually stop and think about it because I wasn't sure. So sometimes we're not even aware of our own biases, our own tendencies, but we do it because we know what's appropriate and what's not, even though we haven't really written a dissertation on it yet. So again, just becoming a little more aware of what you do and why. And so if you're doing things in a conversation with your grandparents that you can perceive or have perceived that is helpful for them and they feel respected and loved, and you actually might want to think about, what am I doing and how can I convey that to my child so that they can do that too and just become more aware and actually have those conversations, because we don't often, except like, be nice. But nice is culturally embedded. All right. So here again, just to review, here you have the red university culture, and here you have all the other, or at least some of the other subcultures that are part of our group of persons here in our community. And we just want to be aware that, again, it's not that persons from other communities or subcultures can't function here. They're here, they're doing it, they're amazing, right? But just to be aware of what we might ask or think about, or have on our radars, right, to enter into those conversations about how to make people feel like they can voice a different opinion in a way that's comfortable for them without being disrespectful, right? In a way that they can find spaces, it might not be every committee meeting, find spaces that are helpful for them, that make them feel like they can kind of let their hair down and, negotiate, communicate, have conflict in ways that feel comfortable and natural for them. So, this happens. There's a department, where really one of the department members very seldom spoke up in department meetings. And it was just one of several things that made the relationship really tense. Again, it's not just one thing in isolation, right? But it's that in combination with many other things. But many of the things, when I sat down and analyzed the situation, were related to communication and conflict preferences or styles or adeptness even, right? And so what do you do? Well, you try to have those conversations and you try to create spaces and ways for that person to contribute, to express other opinions or similar opinions, but in ways that didn't like transgress all their social rules inside their hearts, right, for how to do that in good ways. Okay, and this has happened. We've had things that just the communication thing was a part of it. There were other things happening too, but we've had people leave or not be reappointed because this is part of the picture of why that's happening. Right. So it is important to consider those things. All right, so because we're an academic culture and I'm like the direct, a little bit more emotionally restrained, this is what we're doing. We're growing our understanding of communication and conflict styles in order to better welcome and understand our cultural differences. We are going to, please, try to create systems and procedures and practices to invite input from persons who operate with more indirectness and formality. That could also be with students. There are some students who are less likely to say, I didn't understand that, right? Because it feels like I'm saying you did a bad job, or they just don't want to, it would be somehow feel bad for them to admit that they don't get something. Right? Well, some of your students are like, I don't get that, can you explain it again? Or some are even more like, you didn't explain that well, do it again. Right? We have that whole range, but to understand that sometimes it's a culture-based communication and conflict preference that will make your students nod their head when you say, do you understand? And what they're really, they don't. But they're going to nod their head because to say they don't understand would be, just for many reasons, not the right answer for them to give them. So we're going to change how we think about expressiveness and emotions so that emotional is not automatically the opposite of objective or scientific or reasonable. Okay. And then we're going to build our cultural intelligence, including these interpersonal skills related to communication and conflict styles, so that we can better understand and engage with others. All right, thank you. If you want more fun activities and stories, I recommend this book. It's not expensive, and it has fun ways to read with a group, and then a whole bunch of activities you can do for every chapter. So that's kind of cool. It's a small group activity. If you want to dive a little bit deeper into especially the BIPOC subcultures in the United States, this is the link to that, and if you want it, you can email me and I'll send it to you. Don't forget that this also, I think, can count as a CCPD, Cultural Competency Professional Development activity, as well as an Unlearn Week and International Education Week activity. So if you're keen to get your t-shirt or fulfill that employment requirement, I encourage you to either go online, Human Resources, to fill out your CCPD, or talk to Jenny Bruin about getting your t-shirt. All right, thank you so much for your time, everybody.